Have you ever stopped to think that a simple old painting could hold a secret so disturbing it defies even logic? Well, before we begin this story, let me ask you, are you already subscribed to this channel? If not, take advantage now, because what I'm about to reveal could change the way you look at the past and your own fears. Oh, and please like and comment what you thought. This really helps the content reach more people. The biggest controversy surrounding this case is precisely the paradox it entails. How can a painting dating from the 19th century perfectly depict a woman who disappeared today? Coincidence? Fraud? Or is there something that escapes us, something that science has been unable or unwilling to explain? I confess, I have rarely felt such a genuine thrill while investigating a work of art. The truth is, this story isn't just about a disappearance, it's about identity, about destinies that seem to repeat themselves, and about the strange sensation that time can bend before our eyes. If you've ever believed that some mysteries simply have no explanation, this case will force you to question every certainty you hold. And that's why I want you to stay with me until the end of this investigation. Because with each detail revealed, you'll realize that the portrait wasn't just a painting, it was a mirror, and perhaps a warning. I remember exactly the first time my eyes fell upon that old portrait. The canvas, dusty and worn with time, seemed to hide secrets that only the most attentive could decipher. There was something magnetic about that woman's features, as if the painting had a life of its own. It was impossible not to feel a shiver as I noticed every detail painted with almost obsessive precision. It wasn't just art, it was like a window into something I didn't yet understand. The curious thing is that, even dating from the 19th century, the portrait conveyed a strange sense of familiarity. As a researcher, I've come across countless bizarre coincidences, but this one struck me differently. It was like recognizing someone in an unfamiliar crowd. That woman wasn't just a figure frozen in oil on canvas, she seemed to truly exist, as if she'd stepped through time to face me. And I, stubborn as ever, couldn't ignore this silent call. When I began my research, I discovered that the painting had surfaced at an obscure antiques auction, acquired by a collector fascinated by unusual stories. He described the feeling of being observed by the work, to the point where he couldn't resist taking it home. I confess that, at that point, I thought it was just an exaggeration by those who romanticize ancient art, but I was wrong. The deeper I delved, the clearer it became that this painting was no mere relic. And it was right there, upon my initial discovery, that I realized the portrait wasn't just a face. It held a story, something much greater than mere aged pigments. And believe me, it didn't take long for this investigation to draw me into an even more disturbing mystery, the resemblance of the woman portrayed to a real modern-day victim. The first time the portrait gained official attention was almost by accident. A collector, the kind who spends hours at antique fairs sniffing out rarities, took the painting home, never imagining what would happen next. Days later, leafing through the newspaper, he came across a photo of a missing woman, and to his astonishment, the face was identical to the one in the painting that now adorned his living room. Just imagine, you buy an old painting, and suddenly it bears the vivid image of someone who should never have been there. When I first heard this story, I confess I was skeptical. Coincidences happen every day, don't they? But in this case, there was something more than mere chance. The collector reported that, when he looked at the painting, he felt chills, as if the woman were trying to say something. It wasn't just a physical resemblance, it was a presence, a dense energy that lingered in the space. For anyone like me who has dealt with haunted houses, this sensation is nothing new, but it never ceases to be unsettling. I decided to visit the man and examine the painting in person. It was then that I realized how the resemblance left no room for doubt. The missing woman seemed to have stepped directly from the canvas. The lines of her face, the deep-set eyes, even her posture, everything was exactly the same. The question that haunted me was, how could a 150-year-old painting reproduce the appearance of someone who was still alive, or at least had been until recently? As I examined the work with special gloves and flashlights, I noticed that the environment seemed to react to our presence. The air grew heavier, and the nervous collector swore he saw the woman's expression change subtly when we turned off the light. This could be imagination, of course, but I've learned that the human imagination is a valuable ally in investigations like this. It reveals fears, beliefs, and hidden clues. What I didn't yet know was that this would be just the first link in a much darker chain. The victim, whose face was a faithful reflection of the painting, had a seemingly ordinary life. She worked in an office, kept a small social circle, and, in the eyes of her neighbors, was too discreet to attract any attention. However, as an investigator, I've learned that the ordinary almost always hides extraordinary secrets, and this case was no different. As I delved into her records, I realized there was more to her than a quiet routine. There were deep emotional scars. Family members recounted strange episodes the woman had experienced before her disappearance. She confided in me that she felt someone watching her constantly, even from inside her own home. She also spoke of recurring dreams, in which she was portrayed by a man with ancient features holding paintbrushes. I've heard many accounts of people carrying premonitions, but never one so detailed, so connected to a physical object from another time. This detail set me on high alert. Another curious point was her medical history. Records indicated anxiety attacks and unexplained memory lapses, as if she lived between two different worlds. Doctors classified them as dissociative disorders, but the synchrony between the symptoms and the painting could not be ignored. Her face didn't just resemble the one in the painting, it was identical, like a carbon copy, down to the smallest details, like the curve of her eyebrows and the line of her lips. As I progressed in my investigation, I began to realize that this woman carried something beyond her own story. She seemed to be the centerpiece of a centuries-old enigma. She wasn't just a victim of disappearance, but the living representation of a bridge between past and present. And with each new discovery, the feeling that the painting was directly linked to her fate became more impossible to deny. It was at this point that the investigation gained even greater weight. When experts analyzed the canvas, they confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that the painting dated back over 150 years. This left no room for modern forgeries, nor for simple coincidences. After all, how could a 21st century woman have her face immortalized in a centuries-old work? This realization shook even the most skeptical members of the team, and I can assure you, it's not easy to see hardened police officers lose sleep. I myself spent entire nights staring at those analysis photos, trying to find some detail that would tell me it's just a resemblance. But with every line of the face, every painted shadow, it was impossible not to admit the victim was the same as the one on the canvas. That's when I began to remember other cases where time seemed to fold in on itself. Investigations where ancient objects held secrets not yet experienced. It sounds crazy, I know, but experience has taught me not to underestimate the paradoxes of reality. This time, Jump began to raise bolder hypotheses. Could the victim have been somehow connected to the past? Reincarnation, spiritual projection, time travel, everything was considered, even if mockingly by some. However, the more experts dismissed rational explanations, the more the inexplicable became the only plausible option, and it is on this threshold, between science and mystery, that my work always finds the most fertile ground. The feeling was as if the canvas had traversed the centuries just to reach her, or perhaps us. The painting seemed a meeting point between distinct eras, a warning that something greater was at stake. And the more we investigated, the more the boundaries between present and past blurred. It was then that the most enigmatic figure in all of history emerged. The mysterious painter, the one who brought to life the face that shouldn't exist. The painter's name appeared in ancient records, nearly erased by time. A little-known artist, he was described as eccentric and reclusive, someone who rarely allowed strangers near his studio. Most intriguingly, documents from the time mentioned his interest in occult practices, spiritualist sessions, and even experiments with lucid dreaming. To many, he was simply an eccentric. To me, he was a key piece in understanding how a face from the future could end up on such an ancient canvas. Throughout my career, I've learned not to underestimate the human mind. Some artists see beyond the visible, as if touching something most of us dare not even imagine. In this painter's case, contemporaries reported that he spoke of seeing people who had not yet been born. An enigmatic phrase, don't you think? Many called him crazy, others considered him a visionary. But ultimately, what seemed like delirium may have been the genesis of this entire enigma. As I dug deeper, I found letters in which he described being haunted by female figures in his dreams, women who insisted on returning, life after life. It was as if the art were merely a reflection of visions he couldn't control. Reading these words, I remembered how many cases I've seen where people claim to be haunted by memories that weren't theirs. It may sound absurd, but when you've been in houses where clocks stopped exactly the minute someone died, you learn to keep an open mind. The painter left no known descendants, nor any disciples who could carry on his work. It was as if his life had been as enigmatic as the figures he portrayed. But what truly caught my attention was the discovery of an almost forgotten detail. On the back of the painting were strange notes, indecipherable symbols, and Latin phrases that seemed to hold the next link in this puzzle. When we finally turned the canvas over and examined the back, we were met with something that at first glance appeared to be just meaningless scribbles. But upon closer inspection, I noticed hand-engraved symbols, markings reminiscent of sigils used in ancient rituals. Among them were Latin phrases that, translated, spoke of the repetition of souls and the inevitable return. This wasn't simply an artist's signature, it was a message left with intention. And believe me, such intentions are rarely innocent. In my profession, I found notes hidden behind paintings, revealing crimes of passion, but never anything so charged with mysticism. The words seemed to carry a weight that echoed in the silence of the room. Even the police officers present felt uncomfortable. Some even laughed to hide their fear, a typical defense mechanism in the face of the inexplicable. But I knew those inscriptions were clues, fragments of a puzzle connecting art, spirituality, and crime. It was curious to note how the handwriting oscillated between firmness and desperation. Some words were heavily scratched, almost as if the painter had struggled with his own creation. The symbols, on the other hand, demonstrated ritualistic precision. This reminded me of other cases where criminals left encrypted messages. But in this case, it seemed more than a signature. It was a warning, and warnings like these should not be ignored. These discoveries made me question how far the painter had gone in his search for the unknown. Had he merely reproduced a vision, or had he somehow captured the essence of that woman in the painting? With each new letter deciphered, the canvas seemed to come to life, as if about to reveal its own truth. And it was at this point that I realized the importance of going back in time and understanding the historical context in which it all began. To understand the full extent of this mystery, I had to delve into the 19th century, the period in which the canvas was painted. It was a time marked by a collective fascination with spiritualism, when bourgeois salons welcomed curious mediums and scientists for sessions seeking contact with the beyond. It was no coincidence that the painter lived in this very setting, a world divided between Enlightenment reason and a thirst for the supernatural. It was as if science and the occult were dueling under the same roof. While researching newspapers from the time, I found accounts of people claiming to see figures reappearing at different moments in history, as if certain souls were trapped in an endless cycle. This belief was fueled by archaeological discoveries and advances in photography, which sparked the idea of freezing time and capturing eternal memories. Isn't it curious how humanity always tries to control what escapes its control? The portrait seemed to be the embodiment of this attempt. As I read about the spiritual trends of that era, I remembered how many times in my career I've encountered people seeking answers in cards, tarot cards, and even inherited objects. The desire to understand the inexplicable spans generations, and in this case, it seemed the painter had been consumed by it. His work wasn't just a painting, it was a silent manifesto of his belief in reincarnation and the persistence of the soul. This historical backdrop made it even more plausible that the artist had delved into unconventional practices to compose his works. He wasn't just portraying faces, he was recording echoes of other lives. And curiously, accounts from his time spoke of witnesses who claimed to have seen the same woman in the portrait wandering through different contexts as if she had never belonged to a single era. It was then that I realized there were more people who swore they had encountered her, and these testimonies needed to be recovered. In the dusty archives of a small regional library, I found surprising accounts. 19th century writers described a mysterious woman who appeared at parties, markets, and even religious ceremonies, but who never seemed to age. The accounts varied in detail, but all highlighted the same appearance: deep-set eyes, pale skin, and an unsettling aura, as if she were displaced in time. It was the same woman from the portrait and from the current victim. These testimonies were so vivid that they seemed more like personal diaries than official records. Some said she would appear in the crowd and disappear before anyone could approach her. Others claimed she would approach to talk, but spoke in a strange language, as if the words were jumbled. The repetition of these details in different documents led me to believe that people had indeed seen something they couldn't explain. The most striking thing was finding an account by a priest of the time, known for his skeptical stance towards spiritualism. In his notes, he said that this woman's presence made him feel as if he were facing a racked soul trapped in raw flesh. Now, when even the most rational people let slip comments like this, it's because logic can no longer sustain the mystery. And I, having interviewed witnesses of hauntings in the 21st century, know well how doubt can corrode even the most steadfast. These descriptions reinforced the idea that it wasn't just a coincidence, but rather a figure that spanned generations without ever belonging to just one. The painting wasn't the only record of her, it was just one more piece of evidence among many. With so many voices from the past echoing, there was no alternative but to bring the investigation into the present day, placing the portrait in official custody and beginning a police investigation that would completely change the course of history. When the case grew in scale, the police finally intervened, and the portrait was collected as evidence. Seeing that canvas being placed inside a protective bag, as if it were a murder weapon, was a scene that left a lasting impression on me. After all, it wasn't just an art object. It was a living element in the puzzle of a real disappearance. Interestingly, even the most pragmatic investigators expressed discomfort with keeping that painting inside the police station. In the forensic room, the atmosphere was tense. I remember one of the technicians, a man who had already examined dozens of brutal scenes, confessing that he had never felt so repulsed when analyzing an object. "It's like she's looking inside my head," he said, pointing to the eyes of the woman portrayed. This statement made me reflect on how some mysteries can overcome the barriers of logic and take root in the psyche, provoking reactions that no physical evidence could justify. While the reports confirmed the work's historical authenticity, ruling out any possibility of recent forgery, more questions arose than answers. How could a contemporary victim have the same appearance as a painting painted a century and a half earlier? This paradox began to unsettle not only the police, but also the public, who soon became aware of the case. The painting, previously forgotten in an obscure auction, became the center of a high-profile investigation. And, as with any high-profile investigation, rumors and theories began to multiply. Some claimed the victim had been chosen by a secret sect. Others spoke of a curse. But with so many possible avenues, the police needed to focus on the most tangible criminal hypotheses. And it was precisely at this point that theories about possible modern forgeries began to emerge, even though all the evidence pointed to the contrary. When the similarity between the victim and the painting came to light, the police's first line of reasoning was to seek rational explanations. Perhaps someone had recently forged the painting and artificially aged it to create a fantastical connection. This hypothesis seemed comfortable because keeping your feet on the ground is almost always the safest way to conduct an investigation. But as the reports progressed, this theory began to crumble. Carbon-14 tests showed that the materials used were, in fact, from the 19th century. Pigments, paints, and even the wood of the frame were genuinely ancient. This completely debunked the idea of a modern forgery. It's curious how, in many cases, the biggest challenge isn't dealing with the unexplained, but accepting that it exists. And the more the logical doors closed, the more researchers were forced to consider unconventional hypotheses. Some police officers, however, persisted in alternatives. It could be a genetic coincidence, someone in the victim's family who had served as inspiration for the painter. Others even considered digital manipulation to forge similarities in the comparative images. I've seen forgers excel at creating virtually perfect documents, but none of them could have fooled such rigorous laboratory tests. This stubbornness in denying the mystery only reminded me, the human mind is terrified of what it can't explain. In the end, the usual criminal hypotheses were exhausted, one by one. The painting resisted attempts at logical reduction, remaining a disturbing link between eras. It was then that the investigation took an unexpected turn. If logic no longer explained it, perhaps it would be necessary to turn to those who deal with that which escapes reason. And that's when the experts in paranormal phenomena entered the scene. When the paranormal experts were called in, the atmosphere of the investigation changed immediately. Some police officers turned up their noses. Of course, there's always resistance when science and mysticism share the same table. But to my surprise, the initial analysis was straightforward. This woman is the very soul depicted by the painter. She's not just connected to the painting, she belongs to it. Powerful, isn't it? Even I, who've heard it all, had to take a deep breath to keep from getting the chills. These experts spoke of reincarnation, spiritual echoes, and even portals that could be opened by energy-charged objects. I know, it may sound absurd, but I've been in houses where paintings moved without anyone touching them, and clocks always stopped at the same minute someone passed away. Experiences like these taught me not to dismiss anything prematurely. The portrait, according to them, wasn't just a representation, it was a link, a prison, or perhaps a warning. As we listened to his explanations, I noticed that the victim's own family was beginning to connect the dots. Memories of strange comments from her surfaced, reports of dreams that seemed to foretell the inevitable. Psychics said the painter had captured more than just the image of a woman, he had imprisoned her essence, condemning her to reappear in different cycles of history. Today's victim would, therefore, be just another manifestation of this cycle. The police, of course, didn't know how to handle this kind of conclusion. How could they put reincarnation in an official report? But even so, the experts' words lingered in the air, like a shadow no one could ignore. And when we began investigating the family's accounts, we discovered something even more disturbing: the recurring nightmares the victim had been describing before her disappearance. The victim's family reported that, weeks before her disappearance, she began suffering from strange dreams. She often spoke of a man with ancient features, dressed in an old-fashioned way, who watched her silently as he painted her face. There was no direct violence in these dreams, but the feeling of imprisonment was suffocating. She would wake up sweaty, trembling, repeating the same phrase, "He's trying to trap me in the canvas." It sounded like a delusion, until we realized the connection with the portrait. Nightmares play a curious role in criminal investigation. I've seen cases where they foreshadow details of crimes that were only later confirmed. The mind, in a vulnerable state, seems to pick up signals that waking reason cannot translate. In this woman's case, the dreams were so detailed they bordered on prophecy. She described the texture of the canvas, the smell of fresh paint, and even the creaking of the painter's easel, elements that only someone inside an old studio could sense. With each new account from the family, the narrative grew darker. It was as if the painter, even though he'd been dead for over a century, had reached out to her in another life. And this idea wasn't just frightening, it was also symbolic. How many of us don't sometimes feel trapped in invisible cycles, repeating stories that seem to date back to before we were even born? Perhaps this was the most disturbing reflection of the case, the feeling that it wasn't just hers, but all of us. These dreams weren't just ignored premonitions, they became crucial pieces of the puzzle. And when we cross-reference the dates of her most intense nightmares with the last time she was seen in public, we notice an unsettling coincidence. The places she passed seemed to echo the painter's own story, until, on one of those nights, her disappearance occurred in a place with a strong connection to art. An old, ruined gallery. The last time the victim was seen still gives me chills. Witnesses reported that she was walking alone at night toward an old, abandoned art gallery in the city center. The building, riddled with cracks and graffiti, had been the site of dark stories, mysterious fires, disappearances, and occult group meetings. It wasn't exactly the kind of place someone would wander into by accident. It was as if something bigger had drawn her there. Arriving at the site, I found footprints in the dust, the remains of burned candles, and walls covered in strange symbols. It wasn't the first time I'd investigated ruins with evidence of rituals, but in this case, the sensation was suffocating. The air felt heavy, as if carrying secrets still lingering. You know when you enter a place and feel like someone just left? That was exactly the feeling that stayed with me throughout my inspection. Nearby residents reported that that night, they heard muffled screams coming from the building, followed by a deathly silence. Some swore they saw lights coming on in the second-floor windows, even though the building hadn't had electricity for decades. These accounts, though contradictory, were unanimous on one detail. They all mentioned the presence of a woman in a light-colored dress watching from the windows. Her description matched that of the victim. It was at this point that the investigation ceased to be simply a search for a missing person and became a delve into a psychological and spiritual labyrinth. The gallery seemed to function as a portal between the victim's life and the painter's traces. But there was still something that deeply intrigued me. Behind all this mystery, we discovered that the victim had already been facing internal conflicts long before her disappearance, as if her mind were trying to decipher something her body had not yet experienced. While investigating the victim's history, I came across medical reports that caught my attention. They included records of identity crises, moments when she claimed not to recognize her own reflection in the mirror. She also spoke of memory lapses and a constant feeling of not belonging in this time. The doctors considered this to be dissociative disorders. To me, it seemed like the echo of something deeper, something that transcended clinical diagnoses. These crises were described as episodes of intense anguish. The woman would wake up in the middle of the night, believing she was in another time, calling out the names of people who had never existed in her social circle. I remember an aunt reporting that she once asked to light the lamps, as if she were trapped in the 19th century. This may sound like delusion, but within the investigation, each detail served as a piece of a larger puzzle. It's curious how the human mind holds layers that we can't always comprehend. I've seen cases where past traumas emerged in inexplicable ways, such as specific phobias or recurring dreams, but in her case, there seemed to be a direct link between her psychological state and the painter's work, as if painting had the power to revive memories that didn't belong exclusively to this life, a cycle that insisted on repeating itself, disguised as illness. These accounts made me wonder, what if her seizures were actually manifestations of something trying to communicate? What if it wasn't just a disorder, but a calling? This line of thought, risky as it seemed, led me to revisit the painting itself, and it was there, staring into those eyes painted over a century ago, that I noticed the most disturbing detail. They seemed to move, as if observing my every gesture. There's something in that woman's eyes that defies logical explanation. When you stand face to face with the portrait, you feel as if she's following your every move, as if she were alive inside the canvas. It wasn't just an optical illusion, the kind any skilled artist can create. It was something deeper, as if there were a conscious presence behind the painting. Even the most skeptical participants in the analysis admitted to feeling uncomfortable. I myself have found myself locked in that gaze for long minutes, unable to look away. It was like standing before someone keeping a secret and trying to reveal it silently. In other investigations, I've encountered objects that seem to carry similar energies. A mirror that always fogged up in front of certain people, or a photograph that revealed figures not in the room, but nothing compared to the hypnotic intensity of those painted eyes. Art experts tried to explain the phenomenon technically. They spoke of the use of light, the depth of the gaze, the painter's technique, but all these arguments fell apart when, in practice, the eyes seemed to change expression. Witnesses claimed that at certain moments, she seemed to smile slightly, and at others, her expression became cold and menacing. It was as if the canvas had its own mood, reacting to whoever dared to look at it. This detail put me on alert. If the eyes were indeed the key to understanding the connection between the victim and the painting, perhaps they revealed more than just artistic technique. Perhaps they carried a coded truth, a link that spanned generations. And this clue only gained strength when we investigated the victim's genealogy, discovering that his own family had roots in the same village where the painter lived. As I delved into the victim's genealogy, a discovery made me pause for a moment. His ancestors were directly linked to the same village where the painter lived. There, in yellowed parish records, I found repeated surnames, blood connections, that spanned generations. It wasn't just a geographical coincidence, it was as if the destinies of the family and the artist had always been intertwined, caught in an invisible web. This link raised a new hypothesis. Perhaps the woman wasn't just similar to the figure in the portrait, but the heir to a story that transcended her. How many times have you heard that certain traits, traumas, or even talents run in families, as if we inherited not only our DNA but also the pain and secrets that preceded us? Well, this case seemed to be living proof of this kind of hidden inheritance. I spoke with local historians, and curiously, many mentioned legends about marked families destined to repeat tragedies over time. It was as if the family tree carried not only names, but also burdens. And at that point, I began to see the portrait not as a coincidence, but as a symbol, a memory painted to span the centuries and reach that particular descendant. This discovery paved the way for something even more disturbing. Because if this woman had roots in the painter's homeland, perhaps she wasn't the only one. And it was this clue that gained traction when a new victim emerged, equally similar to the figure portrayed. It was as if the painting had become a cruel mirror, choosing who would be the next reflection. Just when we thought we had uncovered enough, the story took its most disturbing turn. A new victim disappeared, and her face, to everyone's horror, also reflected the woman in the portrait. It was as if the painting had taken on a life of its own, extending its tentacles beyond time. This second disappearance dispelled any theory of coincidence. We were faced with a pattern, and it completely changed the course of the investigation. I remember the silence that fell over the room when we received confirmation of the similarity. It wasn't just déjà vu, it was the almost surgical repetition of the same physiognomy. Some investigators despaired, others closed in disbelief. I, on the other hand, felt a pressure in my chest, as if the painting were challenging us to face an even darker truth. With each new piece fitted together, the puzzle seemed to expand, rather than resolve itself. This moment was crucial because it challenged even the logic of life's continuity. Two women, from different eras, with the same face, the same aura of mystery, the same tragic destiny. It made me think about how we often repeat cycles in our own lives without realizing it, as if we were condemned to live different versions of the same story until we learned to break the pattern. Perhaps the painting was just an extreme reflection of this invisible law. The presence of this new victim brought not only more pain to the families involved, but also a layer of urgency to the investigation. If the portrait was indeed linked to a series of disappearances, the next step would be to decipher its hidden symbols, because, somehow, I already sensed it. The painter had left more clues hidden beneath the layers of paint. During the painting's restoration process, something unexpected came to light. Beneath layers of paint darkened by time, the figure of a broken hourglass emerged, barely visible to the naked eye. It wasn't a decorative detail, it was a powerful symbol, a silent warning of the end of a cycle, or perhaps the impossibility of escaping it. The discovery transformed the atmosphere of the room. Even the restorers, accustomed to dealing with secrets hidden in works of art, were shocked. The most curious thing is that the symbol didn't appear alone. Around the hourglass, subtle lines appeared that, seen together, formed something similar to a ritualistic circle. To many, this might have been mere artistic daring, but for me, it was the piece that confirmed everything we already suspected. The painter didn't just depict faces, he encoded hidden messages in his work. It was as if the painting were a book of secrets waiting to be read. As I observed each line, I couldn't help but recall other instances in which symbols appeared as clues. Once, during an investigation involving old letters, a simple triangle hidden in a footnote led to the discovery of an entire criminal network. Here, the feeling was similar. The symbol wasn't gratuitous, it pointed to something larger, perhaps a pact, perhaps a curse, or even a mechanism for repeating existence itself. The broken hourglass seemed to scream that time didn't follow its natural order, that it could be broken and remade. This interpretation gave meaning to the recurring faces, the victim's psychological crises, and the disappearances, but as always happens in the most complex investigations, the answers came with even more questions. And deep down, I already knew, even with all these revelations, the mystery was far from over, especially since the victim's body was never found. Despite all efforts, the victim's body was never found. This absence turned the case into a maze with no exit, where every clue seemed to lead us back to the same point, the portrait. I've been involved in investigations where the missing body was a ploy criminals used to buy time, but here, it was different. The feeling wasn't of concealment, but of absorption, as if the victim had ceased to exist on the physical plane and taken up residence in another space, perhaps within the painting itself. This emptiness is in some ways crueler than a tragic confirmation. Family members are suspended between hope and grief, unable to move on. With each passing day, I saw them withering, without answers, clinging only to memories and questions that were never answered. As an investigator, I've learned that the silence of absence speaks louder than any visible clue. And here, that silence was deafening. The police files listed the case as unfinished, but for me, it was far from closed. It was as if the portrait laughed at our helplessness, remaining untouched, motionless, yet carrying with it the power of a living secret. How many times had I spent hours staring at that painting, hoping it would give me a clue, a sign, anything that would break the cycle of uncertainty. But all I received was the nagging feeling that it knew more than I could ever discover. This open mystery made me reflect on how many stories of humanity remain suspended, waiting for the right perspective to be deciphered. The absence of a body didn't mean the end of the investigation, but the beginning of a dark legacy. After all, the portrait remained in safekeeping, locked away in a police archive, and curiously, the rumors surrounding it only intensified, giving rise to even more disturbing rumors. Today, the painting remains locked in a police file, guarded as if it were a real danger. Officially, it's just a piece of evidence. But among the corridors and whispers, some swear that no one emerges unscathed after staring into those eyes for too long. One of the officers confided in me that after a night on duty, he dreamed of the woman calling out to him, begging to be released. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in my experience, when multiple reports point in the same direction, there's no ignoring it. The portrait's fame grew like wildfire. Professional colleagues avoid entering the room where it hangs, and even the most skeptical stay away, fearing something unwanted might cling to them. Rumor has it that those who stare intently at the painting end up having dreams about the victim, as if summoned to continue a story that never ends. And this legend, fueled by fear and curiosity, only reinforces the weight of the mystery. I always say that every case leaves its mark on those who investigate it, but this one went even further. It's as if the painting itself had chosen me, leaving an invisible trail that follows me to this day. It's not uncommon for me to wake up at night with the feeling of being watched, as if the woman's gaze had crossed time and space just to find me. With each new memory, the question recurs in my mind: did the painter imprison only the victim, or also those who dare investigate his work? This dark legacy doesn't end in the police file. It lives on in every whisper, every nightmare, every suspicious look the screen evokes. And perhaps that's precisely the greatest enigma. No matter how hard we try to decipher it, the story insists on remaining alive, like a flame that refuses to be extinguished. And in a way, I feel like this investigation isn't over. Maybe it's just waiting for the next person to look into that woman's eyes. So, after everything you've heard, tell me, to what extent do you believe our lives are truly under our control? Do we repeat invisible patterns, just as the woman in the portrait seemed to repeat her own existence? Or do we prefer to close our eyes to the inexplicable because it's more comfortable to believe the mystery doesn't touch us? The big question here isn't just about the painting, but about us. How many times have you found yourself stuck in the same mistakes, the same paths, as if you were acting out a story already written? Perhaps this case is just a reminder that time may not be as linear as we think, and that the past, somehow, continues to watch us. Now I want to hear from you. What would you do if you had this portrait at home? Would you keep it hanging on your wall, or burn it before closing your eyes at night? Answer in the comments, because I'm sure your insight will add even more layers to this collective investigation we're undertaking together. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like. This ensures you'll continue to follow each new mysterious case I bring here. After all, you don't want to miss the next enigma that could shake up everything you believe in, do you?